Hello everyone, this is lecture number 2 for California Labor. This lecture is called Linked Labor Histories. I'd like you to take a look at the two pictures that we have here on the cover slide. On the left is something that should be rather familiar to you. This is the official picture that was taken as part of the Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory Point, Utah on May 10th, 1869. This basically commemorates the meeting of the eastern portion of the railroad meeting with the western portion of the railroad. Basically, what we begin to understand is that this is the official linking of the United States, so that manifest destiny was essentially accomplished, so that the U.S. was connected materially and economically from the East Coast to the West Coast, or the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. In high school, you probably have heard a lot about the history of the railroad and why it played a significant role in U.S. labor or U.S. history, in large part because it allowed large-scale capital development and the transportation of resources across the country. But I think what I really want to point out here is really looking at this picture that they purposely used as a historic moment to commemorate the meeting of the two railroads of East meeting West. What you'll note is that while Chinese railroad workers were present at the site, they were deliberately excluded from this photograph. Look very closely, there are no Chinese workers in this picture, despite the fact that the Chinese were the predominant workforce that actually built the railroad, particularly coming from California. Now, if you look at the picture on the right, this is actually one of the historic pictures that show the actual building of the railroad. And what this particular picture highlights is that you actually had both Chinese workers as well as Canadian citizens who were very instrumental in the building of the railroad. What we do know, and in particular as it relates to this particular picture, is that the building from the west was particularly dangerous as they went through the Sierra Nevada mountains. The workers had to transport and handle high-level explosives in order to blast through the Sierra Nevada mountains. These were extremely dangerous conditions, and they resulted in very high fatalities for all workers. And so on the one hand, while you have these work conditions that are very dire and dangerous and led to high levels of fatalities, and that this work was done in large part by the immigrant labor force, in particular the Chinese immigrant labor force, it wasn't necessarily deemed important, because if you look again on the left side of your screen, their work was made invisible in the historic picture that was taken to commemorate that moment. What this is really emblematic of is the type of silencing that happens in history, of the ways in which power plays out even in the telling of a story, and the kind of story that it tells about race in the United States, particularly during that time. And so part of why I tell this story is because it is important for us to start applying the integrated framework that Evelyn Econo-Glenn talks about in this week's reading. And that we begin to understand how power works, how we look at history, and more importantly, how we also think about what work is valued and not valued. In today's lecture, I'll talk a little bit about power and defining power. This lecture broadly covers both labor history and what I'll call unequal citizenship, as well as I'll give a background of the sort of linked labor history of both slaves, coolie labor, and braceros, and finally I'll give at least a brief outline of the integrated framework, although the expectation is that you should have read about the integrated framework in depth. So first, particularly as I've noted in my first lecture, I'm somebody who studies sociology, and so you will hear me use words like social structure and a number of other types of terms throughout, and I'll try to define them. Of course, if you're confused by any of these terms, I invite you to email me or post it on our board in terms of ask a question, so that I can clarify this for you as much as possible. Now, one of the first terms that I think it's important to understand is this idea of a social system, that we're all part of a social system. In other words, as I've noted previously, the social world involves more than just individuals. How society works isn't just about one person, It's that we are participating in something larger than ourselves, a social system, which is about networks. It's about the ways in which we interact with one another, its patterns, its behaviors. It's about how groups act and react to one another. It's about how power structures our relationships. So you will hear me refer to social systems quite a bit throughout this course. Second is this idea of social structure, which C. Wright Mills talked about quite a bit. Um, it's important to understand that our lives do not just consist of random assortment of events or actions, but are actually structured in distinct ways. There are regularities in the way we behave and in the relationships we have with one another. So, for example, what we do know, for those of you who have studied criminology, for example, or the criminal justice system, what we do understand, for example, is that policing is much more heavy in some neighborhoods than others. Some argue that that there's a heavier police presence in some neighborhoods simply because there's more crime there. Or the question becomes, is there more crime there simply because there's more arrests happening? Part of the questions we want to ask are, what are some of the stereotypes that go into a neighborhood being perceived as dangerous or crime-ridden? Is it about race? Is it about what resources are available in that neighborhood? There are very structured and distinct ways in which these things happen. So social structures are not physical things. They're more about relationships and networks, and they will still exist. It's not like a physical building, like a school, for example. Social structures are really about the patterns and behaviors of people. So I think it's important that all of us have a very specific understanding of power. So I'd like you to just take a second and and define for yourself, what is power? So from an academic standpoint, and particularly as it relates to this class, I talk a lot about social power. In 1922, Max Weber talked about power as the chance of a man or a group of men to realize their own will in a communal action, even against the resistance of others who are participating in the action. In other words, they were able to enact or exact their will upon other people. It's important to note that social power in particular should be viewed not as a substance or something that you own, like a car, but it's a relationship. In other words, in order to have power, or for a group to have power, there has to be another group that's disempowered. It's a relationship. It refers to the probability of a given party's success, that if you have more power, more resources, that you will be more likely to have your way. And it refers not so much to the doing of something, but to the capacity of doing something if and when one chooses. In other words, we understand, for example, that there are some groups that could, in the United States, that could really push us towards war, for example, if they wanted to. If they wanted to have their group collectively vote to send us to war. But it's the possibility of their ability to do it that gives them power, not the fact that they're actually going to war. Social power points to a significant social experience or critical dimension, overt or covert, of all social structures. In other words, social power exists in every relationship. Whether we're talking about at the micro level between individuals, student to teacher, we understand that teachers have a very specific power because we give grades. We can also penalize for being tardy or late or any of those things. Um, we, we have a choice to enact that power or use that power. And we also know that it's not just about that micro level interaction. It's also about we understand it within neighborhoods, that there are particular groups. It could be a neighborhood association, a particular group of people who've lived in the neighborhood for quite a bit, or even a gang that can also hold these powers because of their relationship. And obviously, as I've already talked about, it could happen at a much more macro level in terms of a nation or a country or a state. And it's also important to know that while power exists, that doesn't mean individuals can't resist, that people can't fight to gain more social power or to push for change against these obstacles. This is a very sort of central concept when it comes to understanding labor unions, is that while corporations often have power because of their ability to both secure jobs or take them away, unions also have the capacity to negotiate by refusing to work, or pressing companies to change their labor standards. Um, so it always offers the possibility of resistance. Now, power is, as I've talked about in our previous lecture, is very central to this idea of stratification. The more power you have, it increases your access to resources, education, capital, which is both money as well as influence and social networks. It's social networks, and then life chances. Life chances can be the potential to go to college, the potential to live in a safe neighborhood. In other words, all of these things that lead to better outcomes for individuals and groups. And of course, the other side of it is that within stratification, the less power and influence you have, the lower you will be on this pyramid. And the lower you are on this pyramid, you will also have decreased access to all of these very same things. So, sort of a basic concept, right, is that as you move up in the pyramid, you have increased access to these things, and as you move down in the pyramid, you have decreased access. So now let's talk about linked labor histories. One of the things I want to note prior to going through the lecture on this particular section is that I'm not going to necessarily test on all of the nuances of what year was the Emancipation Proclamation and all these sort of things signed. But what I want you to do is to think critically about the relationships that I'm talking about and the ways in which the relationships between these different groups or the histories of these groups have really been important and central to our understanding of U.S. labor history. So all of us have heard and learned about, particularly in high school, the transatlantic slave trade. I think it's important to note that as of 1790, the census found that nearly 1 in 5 Americans were enslaved. 20% of the U.S. population were slaves. Now, if they were going to put an economic value on slaves in the U.S. at the time, it was $3 billion, which is over $83.3 billion today. In other words, the Africans who were forced to come to the United States to work in servitude as slaves were seen as capital, were seen as property. They were not seen as human beings. And at the same time, they were essential to economic growth because without their labor, particularly if we understand the work on the plantations and the work that was done, that entire agricultural industry would have collapsed. And it wasn't until the Emancipation Proclamation was proclaimed in 1862 that slavery ended, right? That we understand that Lincoln's handling of the Emancipation had been very cautious, and while a longtime critic of slavery, his prime goal in the Civil War was the quick restoration of the Union. So it wasn't necessarily just about the slave trade, is that he wanted the economic well-being of the country to be brought back together. As the war continued with the Union victory seemed distant, and Lincoln increasingly turned towards emancipation as a means to aid the war effort. And during the summer of 1862, he discussed the idea with members of his cabinet. Lincoln presented the Emancipation Proclamation to the country, and since Lincoln had no authority under the Constitution to end slavery in areas loyal to the Union, the proclamation was a military measure applying only to Confederate-controlled territory. So again, it's important to know that it wasn't a law as opposed to a military directive. But what we do know is that this effectively led us to the point where we had the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1864, where slavery became illegal. And it abolished slavery shortly after the war. Now, as we begin to think through slavery, we understand that it was about that while it has had numerous historic ramifications that have led to the disempowerment of African American communities, both historically and in the contemporary time, it's also important to know that these power relations were about who were going to be the agricultural labor in the South. But it wasn't just the South, because we know slavery extended across the country into areas like Texas and even into California. Now, here in California, it's important to note that opinion on this on slavery was split. Um, Again, much like the rest of the country, the North being for abolition and the southern part of California being for the slave trade. But as California was seeking to enter the United States during its constitutional convention, slavery was not part of the discussion, in large part because the legislators involved were more interested in having political power than necessarily arguing whether or not slavery should be a practice in California. And so California entered the United States in 1849 as a free state. But while a free state that said that it did not that there was no slavery existed in California, in practice that was actually untrue. In practice, forms of slavery existed in California due to the loopholes in California state law, the lack of enforcement, and slave owners choosing to withhold information from slaves, essentially not telling slaves that in fact that they were free men. And while there's a much longer history here that if those of you who are interested, I'm happy to point you to different websites and to texts. Members of the California State Congress proposed numerous laws that would allow slavery to take place between 1840 and 1860. Um, they also tried to ban uh, entry to freemen to California. These were all very much a part of the very racist history of California that includes the enslavement of Native Americans, particularly in the LA, San Bernardino, and San Diego areas. It was also about the same time that you began to see the first rumblings of anti-Chinese laws that were also occurring throughout California. But I think what's also important to note is that with the slave trade, it was on the one hand they wanted free labor, they wanted labor that they basically did not have to compensate anyone for, and that the denial of or trying to push out freemen from California was also about not wanting to have labor competition in California. And that's very much what was also happening with coolie labor, as I'll talk about a little bit later. And as I also noted, California State Congress also proposed to divide California into two states at one point, one that was a free state and one that was another. And so California was very much part of what we would consider these debates around slavery, the history of slavery, but also this larger debate about the value of labor, and particularly non-white labor in California. And as a side note, as I'll talk about in upcoming weeks, white was not defined the same way uh, in the 1800s or in 1850 as it is now. And so, who was considered white was a very small group of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and at the time, groups like the Italians and the Germans and the Irish, right, were not considered white. That happened much later. So, part of the linked labor history is understanding with the end of the transatlantic slave trade, that didn't mean that it ended the need for labor in California. In fact, it created a higher demand. And so, what we saw develop globally was the coolie trade. Now, the coolie trade took numerous different forms. One was that it was another form of slavery. In some parts of the world, like Brazil and the Caribbean, you began to see that coolie labor or laborers from Asia, especially China and India, became the new slaves. Right? They were stolen from villages, much like Africans were. Um, they were taken against their will to new countries to labor. But there were also other forms of coolie trade which came in the form of indentured servitude, right? In other words, that they signed a contract where they had to pay back for their passage over a period of 7 to 10 years. And so, in the United States, the indentured servitude was the form that it took, where you had these laborers coming and working really for no compensation, because the contracts that they signed were for egregious amounts of money to be trafficked essentially across the ocean to work, particularly on the West Coast in the agricultural fields of California, and in some cases that we've read also in Mississippi and as close by as Cuba. And so I think what's important to note here and what's important to understand um, is that the coolie trade was another form of discriminatory labor in the United States. Again, um, it was part of a system that was meant to promote capitalism and trade, and the need and fill the need for labor at the cost of human life, at the cost of um, and at the cost of the well-being of these individuals. And so these early laborers worked in all sorts of in the very same in very same types of trades as um, as African American slaves had once worked in. Although geographically, the Chinese coolies and Indian coolies were much more located here on the west coast of the United States and in California specifically, where we also had sharecroppers taking over some of the work that we'd seen in the global South. Now, if you were to read Evelyn O'Connell Glenn's entire book, the chapter that you're reading is the first chapter from her book. In her entire book, she actually gives a much sort of larger history of what happened in the South post Emancipation Proclamation. And so, when we think about the coolie trade, it's also again about understanding a system of power and understanding that this was about feeding a large growing industry of agriculture. That it's also part of greater economic development, a great big story of economic development here in the United States. Now, with the end of coolie trades, what you began to see, particularly in California, was that there was a large, particularly anti-Chinese sentiment that ultimately culminated in the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which effectively stopped all migration of Chinese to the United States after 1882. Between 1882 and 1924, there were numerous other laws that were passed that basically created what has been called the Asiatic Barred Zone. Now, this Asiatic Barred Zone essentially, what this essentially did was bar all migration or immigration from Asian countries. And so, what you begin to see here is that as these particular groups started coming to the United States and became, what we do know is that they became labor competition, particularly here in California. There were numerous laws that were enacted and pushed and put into place in order to preserve wages, particularly for white laborers. Um, Timothy Fisher talks about this as it relates to the cannery industries that were very much a part of the work here in California. We also have numerous other folks who have written about this particular time period as it relates to agriculture. But the big story I want you to take away, or the take home point that I want you to walk away with, is understanding that that while they bar one group from working, namely Asians, it didn't mean that the work went away. And it's actually at this point that you began to see the development of the Bracero program, which happened initially after World War II. The program was initially prompted by a demand for manual labor during World War II, and began with the U.S. government bringing in a few hundred experienced Mexican agricultural laborers to harvest sugar beets in the Stockton, California area. The program soon spread to cover most of the United States and provided workers for the agricultural labor market. With the notable exception was Texas, who initially opted out of the program, in preference for what was called an open border policy. And so they were denied braceros by the Mexican government. Um, these It's important to note that the bracero program, unlike what you saw with the coolie labor or slave trade, was done by a series of laws and diplomatic agreements initiated by the United States and Mexico in August 1942 and ended in 1964. And it brought temporary contract laborers to the United States. Over a course of 22 years, it sponsored approximately 4.5 million border crossings of guest workers from Mexico. The program mandated a certain level of wages, housing, food, and medical care for the workers, and kept the standard of living above what many had in Mexico. And so there was a lot of incentives. And so what you begin to see with the Bracero program is largely a male migration from Mexico to work in the fields of the United States. So again, the part of what we want to think about here is that there are numerous I'm shortcutting this Bracero discussion because we have a couple of weeks on where we're talking about agricultural labor, and I will go into much more detail there. But there are some themes that I want you to take away from these sort of three moments that I'm talking about with the transatlantic slave trade, coolie labor, and the Bracero program. Is that what we begin to understand is that labor history in California and the United States are very much hinged to what we need to have a functional and prosperous economy. And particularly during the time period we're talking about, pre-World War II, that was very much attached to to the agricultural industry and the ability to harvest resources. So it's both agricultural industry, but even beyond you're also looking at mining being a very big part of the economy, cannery work as well. All of these different groups that I've talked about, with the braceros, with the coolie labor, with slaves. I would also include there with the migrant experiences, the experiences of migrants such as the German and the Italians and the Irish, as well as another group that we'll talk about that migrated during the Great Depression, the Okies, were all about experiences of exploitation, about exploiting groups of people for their labor. It was about depressing particular prices, particular labor costs, and it was about the type of racialized hierarchy or racialized stratification, right, going back to our term stratification, that occurs as part of a capitalist system. We saw the development, like we said, of a racial hierarchy of which, whether it was at different moments, the African Americans, the Chinese or Asians, or Latinos, and in particular Mexicans, were at the bottom of that hierarchy. And as we will explore throughout this class, it is these hierarchies. These hierarchies are still in place. Right? You also see what we'll also talk about later in class. I'm going to skip the displacement of individuals, but I want to focus really on the separation of families. Particularly while we look at with the slave trade, we already know historically that families were split apart, were stolen from their lands. We see a very similar story with coolie laborers, where it was actually mostly male migration. They left their families behind. Women were left in China, and the men came here. And after the Exclusion Acts were in place, these laborers stayed here. These men stayed here and didn't go back because they couldn't get back into the United States. As such, you had the development of what we call bachelor communities, right, where it was only men in these communities. And then also with Bracero program, you also see some very similar stories that were about men who came here and were separated from their families. And even as we move forward, these themes are going to be the same themes that we see come up when we talk about more contemporary labor history. So keep these themes in mind. These themes should be something that you think about as you're reading. These are themes that you should begin to flag as you're thinking about themes across the different readings, and ask yourself, why are these things happening? What is the rationale? What is the reason? And just as importantly, how do groups of people react to these particular hardships and these particular structural constraints? So, as I noted, the Evelyn Nakano Glenn reading that you were assigned for this very first week is from her book, Unequal Citizenship. This book really focuses a lot on the ways in which race, gender, and citizenship are a central part of the ways in which stratification happens in the United States. Nakano-Glenn defines unequal citizenship as the ways in which rights, resources, and privileges are distributed unevenly across different social groups, categories, and geographies. So, to give you a more contemporary example, one of the examples I often use is the idea is the right to marry, in particular, gay marriage. Now, there are many different arguments that people have for whether or not gay marriage should exist or not. The frame I'm actually going to take is specifically looking at the law. Now, often I've asked my classes, um, in the United States, is does everybody have the same rights if they are in fact a citizen? And unequivocally, my classes have answered yes. If you're a citizen, you have access to the same rights. And I said, well, so in practice, does everybody have the same rights? And if you think about it, the answer is no. So let's take specifically gay marriage. Here you have, let's make the assumption that we're talking about a group of gay and lesbian U.S. citizens. In the eyes of the law, um, across the United States, and not in all states, not all gay and lesbian citizens have the right to marry the person that they choose. We know that that at this point, not that only 15 states actually allow gay marriage to happen. So that means if you are a citizen um, living in Louisiana, a gay citizen living in Louisiana, you don't have access to the same rights, resources, and privileges as a gay citizen in California. So part of what they talk about here is how does citizenship look differently across different parts of the country. So Nakano-Glenn really talks about the fact that this unequal citizenship, and in her case, she's talking about it as relates to race and gender, leads to different access to resources. She also notes that citizenship is used to draw boundaries between those included as members of a community and entitled to respect, protection, and rights, and those excluded and thus not entitled to recognition and rights. So when we talk about citizenship here, it's about what she begins to note is that this inequality leads to stronger rights and access to resources for some and not for others. And so this argument, at this core of her argument, going back to our discussion of stratification, Glenn argues that stratification exists because of unequal citizenship. That this unequal citizenship allows some people increased access to these power, resources, education, capital, social networks, and life chances, and decreases access for others. So that's something central to get from the reading that you've had, is that stratification exists because of unequal citizenship. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the integrated framework here, but I am not going to do a full-blown lecture on this because I expect you to be able to read the reading for this week and discuss it. And as you have questions, or if you want to engage this as part of our reading discussions, we will then kind of continue to have these discussions. But there are some key things or takeaway points you should get from the reading. Number one is that race and gender are defined as mutually constituted systems of relationships, including norms, symbols, and practices organized around perceived differences. In other words, how people act and react to each other is part of a set of norms, that socially constructed norms of that we've learned, that we've been socialized to act or react this way. For example, one of the things that's often talked about in criminology classes or in media classes is that in many ways so many people have been socialized to fear Black and Latino men, such that as people walk down the street, you will see people hug their purses a little bit tighter or cross the street away from African American and Latino men, even if they know nothing about these individuals. These are about perceptions about the systems of relationships. It's organized around these symbols and practices, and it's about inequality, right? These mutually constituted systems of relationships take place at multiple levels. Representation in terms of symbols and language. Representation we talked about in terms of media or how people are depicted. Micro interactions, application of norms, etiquette, and spatial rules to orchestrate social interaction. So that micro interaction is, for example, the person who hugs their purse a little bit tighter or crosses the street is one way of doing it. Then we have social structures, rules and regulation, allocation of power and resources. Here we understand that at different moments of U.S. history and continuing on today, some people adhere to particular laws and others do not, and that is very racialized. She highlights in quite a bit of detail that race and gender in the integrated framework share three key features: relational concepts, they involve representation of material relations, and that power is a constitutive element. I'm actually not going to go into a lot of detail on these three because she does a very good job in the reading. But understand what these three things are. It is extremely important relative to understanding this particular piece of this particular reading. And so, one of the reasons I want you to focus on applying this framework, and I will go back to it in subsequent lectures, is that this semester you're expected to apply this framework in your analysis. Think about the relationship between groups, whether it's um, different men and women of color. Um, it could be about race. In every different instance, we're going to see different ways in which we can apply this framework. Understanding how power works in relationship to the cases that you read. And you should also use the framework to understand how inequality is formed and maintained. So again, understand that take time to really thoroughly read through this framework, understand why it's important, and think about how it applies to everyday life. So that's the end of our second lecture, and I will have the next two lectures up before the end of the week.